Margaret sat in her worn armchair, trying to focus on her knitting as the October wind howled outside her Victorian terraced house. The year was 1970, and since Herbert's passing last spring, she'd grown accustomed to the solitude of her evenings, or so she told herself. Drip, drip, drip. That infernal kitchen tap had been tormenting her for weeks. The plumber was meant to come on Tuesday, but like everything else these days, it had fallen through. The rhythmic dripping seemed louder tonight, somehow more deliberate, as if keeping time with something unseen. A sudden tapping at the front door made her needles freeze mid-stitch. The clock on the mantelpiece showed 9:47 p.m., far too late for any reasonable visitor. The wind had picked up, rattling the windows, and rain lashed against the panes in angry sheets. Drip, drip. Then, tap-tap. Margaret set her knitting aside, her throat tightening. The tapping came again, more insistent this time. Rising slowly, she approached the door, her slippered feet silent on the carpet. A shadow fell across the welcome mat, visible through the gap beneath the door. Then came a soft scratching sound, and she watched, paralyzed, as the brass flap of the letterbox slowly lifted. A pair of eyes peered in, dark, desperate eyes that locked with hers for one terrible moment before vanishing. Drip, drip, then tap, tap, then scratch, scratch. Her hands trembling, Margaret reached for the telephone, only to find it dead. Of course it was. The storm must have brought down the lines. The door tapping resumed, forming a bizarre duet with the kitchen's endless dripping. Something slipped through the letterbox, a piece of folded paper. It fell to the floor. Margaret stared at it, her heart pounding. Finally, gathering her courage, she picked it up and unfolded it. The handwriting was Herbert's. "My darling Maggie, let me in. It's so cold out here." But Herbert had been dead for 8 months. Margaret knew this because she'd put the poison in his evening cocoa herself. Tap, tap, then knocking at the door. The knock became a more urgent banging as Margaret stood frozen in her hallway, realizing that perhaps some secrets refused to stay buried.